Hello Life Drawers, welcome to feedback video week 9. Thank you for sending over your work. It's a little bit sooner than normal this week, but looking forward to seeing how you interpreted the new model, but also how you interpreted a series of longer poses, which we'd not really done before. We'd had longer poses, but they were quite sporadic, so to have several of them in one lesson was refreshing. Actually, it's good to see, and it seems like he got on well with that. I also introduced some acrylic painting, which some people enjoyed and others found a little bit tricky, but we'll see how we progress with that. We only dipped our toe in it this week, so we'll have a look at that in a little bit more detail, or some of us anyway, and we'll see how we get on with that moving forward. Okay, let's have a look at your work. Okay, off we go. Right, well, we're getting off to a good start. This is a lovely drawing. It really captures the good quality of the pose. Proportionately, I think you're generally in a good place. You've the head in relation to the rest of the figure is pretty close. I would say just be careful of your angle on your neck into your shoulder. It seems it could be a little bit softer, a little bit more gradual, and just remember that you've got that little bump there, which we looked at last week, which indicates where your clavicles actually connect up to your scapula, and there's a little bump there. So you could probably get away with widening that arm there. Just needs to come out a little bit more. It seems to come down a little bit too soon there. There's a little bit more of a curve, a little bit more of an arch on that, and maybe even a little curve where the arm meets the torso or the chest. A little bit more of a curve. So with your sternocleidomastoid, I would put it in initially as a guide, which you've got here, but then I would probably get my eraser and just dab it off, just make it a little bit lighter, a little bit softer. It seems a little bit harsh. Yes, get it in there initially, but after that, I'd probably get rid of it. It's a little bit too conspicuous. Just be careful of the angle of that shoulder as well. Because it was a relatively passive pose, your angle on your shoulder, it's too high. That arm looks like it's connecting up in here, when really we know it's going to be coming down at more of an angle like that and dropping down here. I know the hair obscured that shoulder, but judging by the corner of your shoulder, it's too high. You got a lovely arch on your arm there. Could perhaps emphasize that curve there a little bit. A little bump and down into your wrist. Okay. Generally speaking, no, that's really nicely done. Yeah, just be careful with the arm here as well, the lower arm. There's going to be a fold in here where the lower arm connects to the upper arm, and a little bit more of a tapering effect there, and a little bit more emphasis on your contour on your lower arm there. You got a nice sense of it here at the elbow as it connects up to the lower arm. So nicely done on that. This is really nicely done. Got a nice curve from the torso down into the hips, which is a really strong indication of that shape. It's got a nice sense of weight to it, which is what you're after. You want your figures to have a sense of volume and weight. We're always looking to attain that. Just maybe keep an eye on the curve there. Seems a little bit too much of a bump, but curving down into your knee, which might have been just a little bit past that area. I would say it's more here, because I remember the knees were almost lined up, but you're only out by it's only a fraction, but just something to be mindful of there. And you did have the clothing or the quilt or cushion just covering that, and your knee just down, lower leg down a little bit more of an angle like that. At first I thought that was your knee, which I was going to say is too skinny, but I realized that you've got a shadow here. The shadow is a little bit dark, it's a little bit too forceful. It doesn't seem to, it looks like a stain on the knee as opposed to a subtle shadow falling on the knee. And I reckon that your leg needs to come in at a little bit more of an angle. It's a little bit too straight. That knee is a little bit wider because of the foreshortening. And then down. And I think that's about right, actually. Maybe a little bit lower because we've moved that. But something along those lines. So yeah, just moving it ever so slightly. But generally speaking, like I said, you've got a really nice shape to this, and you've got generally your portions are pretty bang on, and you can see that you've benefited from the longer poses, the longer pose. There's a lot more information in there, and you're starting to suggest a little bit of tone. Just be careful with your tone. Curve it. Make sure it follows the curve of the actual topography of the body itself. Block it in just in a general light middle tone. Then look for your darker shadows. But you're going to have a little bit of an overlap with your tone, so it's not too blocky and too harsh. So it's just another thing to look out for. But generally speaking, yeah, really nicely done. Okay, you've created a bit of mystery with this one. We don't have a face to go with it, but that's okay. Generally speaking, again, it's a good indication of the pose. You got some nice loose fluid line work. This is lovely. It's really nicely done. You got some nice shape on your arms either side. That's nicely done as well. With this, just find yourself curving into those shapes a little bit more, as opposed to they're a little bit stiff, and maybe a little bit more emphasis on that muscle on the lower arm, so a little bit more of a curve and flowing into the upper arm. Suggestion of your thumbs a little bit longer than that, a little bit thicker, a little bit longer. Give it a little bit more grace and fluidity. I would say if you're sure, you've got a lovely shape on this upper arm, by the way. That's really nicely done, how it curves into the shoulder there, the upper arm into the shoulder. That's nicely done. I think there was a little bit more of a curve with that upper arm area, and maybe a little bit more emphasis on the upper arm contour. That's nicely done. Curves down into the wrist, and maybe a little bit more of a bump to indicate the actual elbow. It's a little bit soft there, I think. Yeah, so what I was going to say, your shoulder has got a good solid width to it, that's fine. But I reckon your hips are not wide enough. Came out a little bit further than that. So you want to get that full distinguished curvature on the hips, and in relation to the shoulder it's a little bit too small. It doesn't suit the how you've drawn the top of the figure. So something more along those lines, which means we can probably bring that in a little bit. Nice flow down the figure. The general placement of your knee is sound in relation to this other knee. So I was keeping an eye on how they matched up. So of course nothing exists in isolation. So you're always keeping an eye on the areas around it. And your eye gets better at doing that. Your eye sharpens up to comparing the areas around it. The more you draw, the better your eye is acclimatized to that. I think your angle on the leg's not too bad. I think it's a little bit more of a diagonal. There was definitely an overlap of the knee over that arm in the back. And I think you've pretty much got that. A little bit more of a curve there at that joint. And you've got it. So a little bit wider on the hips, that's the main thing. And yeah, maybe just a little bit more of a curvature and a rounded shape on the breast. And of course, because the excuse me, because the breasts are sitting on the chest, which is the rib cage, it's going to follow that curvature because it's not sitting on something flat, it's sitting on something that's curved. So the breast follows that curve, and maybe a little bit more of a curve here as well. But that's the main one, is the width of the hips. Nice one. Okay, nice one. So yeah, again, good indication of the pose. We know exactly what the model's doing. There's a nice sense of weight. There's a nice sense of pressure. It feels solid. That's all good things that we're after. It's just a few small little things. I think the head is a little bit off in relation to the rest of the body. I would say that needs to be a little bit smaller, just a smidge. Either that, or you need to adjust the figure to match the shape of that head. So remember last week when we talked about cranial units. So cranial unit, roughly that shape, which is the top of the cranium, of course, roughly down just at the base of the nose, and you can use that as units of measurement. And it's a nice way of kind of gauging the general proportions, because we had a nice bit of foreshortening in this area of the figure, and we'll have a look at that now in a second. And it definitely feels too small in relation to the size of that head. And be careful to not put your eyes too high on the head, and also not to make them too big. I would say with something like the eyes, I might use pencil for this actually. Keep it nice and simple. Just a little curve, like a little crescent shape, and you don't need to draw in the bottom lid, I would say. Just suggest it. With the nose, try and avoid drawing in the two nostrils like that. It looks quite contrived. I would say go for a triangle shape of tone instead, and just block it in. Don't worry about details. Think about where the shadow is falling, which is usually on the undercurve of the nose, which creates a little triangular shadow shape. It looks like a mouth now at this stage in this demonstration. Let me emphasize that a little bit more. So we got curve for our upper lid, maybe a little bit of a crescent shape for our eye, suggestion of either side of the bridge of the nose. And then for the actual nose itself, see what I mean? Clean that up a little bit. Something along those lines is plenty of information, as opposed to the nostril either side. Definitely avoid that one. Yeah, so it just feels a little bit stiff here again. I give that a little bit more of a sloping curve there from the neck down into the shoulder. You've got a lovely suggestion of where the clavicles meet that shoulder, that little bump where we've got our deltoid that eventually comes out here, and just, I would say it would need to be a little bit wider because of the side of the head, which we covered already, but got a lovely suggestion of what's happening with. See, that was tricky because I remember that there was a little bit of overlap there, so part of the arm was a little bit covered, so I just need to take that into account. And maybe I should use this because it might be easier to see. And just getting a little bit more of a curve. Remember, I think it was a few weeks back now, I suggested that imagine that you've got an apron that ties up behind the neck, the back of the neck, but it creates a heart shape, an upside down heart shape for the breast. That's a nice way of getting continuity and symmetry in that shape. I think it's a nice little trick, and it can give a little bit more of a flow and a better shape. Your arm, just be careful that your thumb isn't too stiff. It's got a little bit more of a flow to it and taper at the end of the thumb. You can group your fingers and mass them just to simplify that shape. A little bit more of a curve there for the upper arm. Again, your early exercises when we were doing our S shapes and our C shapes, and this is where that really comes in handy. Even for your longer poses, you'd still start drawing off that way. So this is where I think the main inconsistency in size, we've got to make that bigger, especially for our foreshortening, and a little bit further out here, and again because of our foreshortening, that area is a little bit thicker, a little bit wider. There's a nice suggestion of the knee. Just be careful with your shadow. It's a little bit blocky, a little bit stiff, and because we made that was tricky. This bit of foreshortened knee. Leg and knee, but I think you've done a pretty good job. I think you saw a little bit more of the leg. It's a little bit too obscured, even though I know that the cushion overlapped it, and that's a little bit lower there, as I remember. And we got a good strong shape to that because that was awkward. That was definitely a tricky bit, and a little curve to your belly button shape will give it more of a sense of capturing the overall kind of spherical shape of that. And just be careful that your shoulder's not too high again. Come down at an angle. I think it went behind the knee and then a little bit lower to the hand, which is a little bit small, so we can extend that a decent amount. Something along those lines. All right, nice one. All right, nice one. Yeah, just a couple of little things. Just be careful, it's quite stiff. And I think one of the reasons some of that is quite stiff is getting a good, strong sense of the shape of the cranium and the head. Don't worry about certain features. The main thing is to spend more focus on the pose itself. But when you are suggesting features, simplify. Just simplify. You can start off with a line that suggests the angle of the eyes, a little notch to suggest the nose, and just a line to suggest where the mouth is. And just be careful of your neck. It's just, again, it's a little bit stiff. It's a little bit more of a sloping curve down, and it's a little bit long. It's a little bit too long, so I would say raise up your shoulder. That's a little bit more of an angle there. And with the sternocleidomastoid, as I mentioned before, draw it in, because it's a little V shape that we know connects to the clavicles, but you can rub it out after that. I think the hair flow. Did the hair flow down behind the neck? I think it did actually. You can mass the hair. Just mass it in basic shape. Yeah, it's just a little bit stiff. So just getting a little bit more of a flowing, curving lines. Good strong suggestion of the shape of the hand though. That's really nicely done. And I would say your hips, a little bit more flow down into the lower leg and a little bit wider. And you can always draw in your knee joints to help you place them. And again, I would say that's a little bit too thin, a little bit too short on the width. But again, nice suggestion of shape of your hands. I like how you've simplified those. That's nice done. And if you have time, you can go in and you can add a little bit more detail. But as it stands, you know, that's nicely suggested. Just group those. Group them into that basic mitten shape for your hands if you need to, and simplify them. Like I said, again, just watch the shape. Try using your upside down heart shape and just a little bit softer flowing lines. Again, this is really nice. I love how you've suggested the hands. I just think that's beautifully done. That thumb is fine, but your fingers just a little bit short. A little bit short there. But generally speaking, that's a lovely, lovely, clean, strong shape, confident shape for your hands. I love how you've got that tapered wrist, flows into the that just before we get to the elbow, that lovely muscle. And you've got a really long, lovely shape on your upper arm there, and yeah, it feels like this drawing's got a little bit more fluidity and movement to it, whereas that one's a little bit stiff. And yeah, again, I prefer the suggestion of your features in this one to that one. I think it's overstated there. And maybe we can say that your hips could be a little bit wider in relation to your shoulders. A little bit wider. But generally speaking, you've captured a good, strong sense of that pose. And with your hair, I mentioned it just a second ago, but mass it in. Just mass it in. What's the general shape? What's the general shape of that hair? If we could simplify it, just block it in, mass it in, and then shade it quickly, like that. And if you want, you can find some little added details, like some of the curves of the ends of the hair and so on, but mass it in generally at first and only add that kind of detail a little bit later. Cool, good stuff. Okay, so just a couple of little things. Yeah, be careful with your neck. Remember that your sternocleidomastoid comes from behind the ear, but the outer edge of the neck will tuck up in by the ear, not in from it. Because remember, when we go back in up behind the ear, it connects to the actual cranium itself, like that. Otherwise, where would that go? It would be up here somewhere, so it wouldn't be able to support the cranium itself. And then you can put your actual hair in, or whenever, and mask that in. And so on. Yeah, simplifying your features. Just a little mark if you need to. And your sternocleidomastoid coming down, and then you've got your angle for your actual clavicles that connect up. You've got a nice shape on your arm there. That's really nice, flowing down into your lower arm and your wrist. Just be careful your wrist isn't too thin and too long. And bring that up maybe. Generally, I like how you simplified that. Better width on your hips, but maybe just flow down into them as opposed to just starting with a curve, because it comes down the side, thorax, abdomen, yeah, and flows into that. That's a better shape on those. Yeah, same thing. Just avoid the nostril shape. That's you don't want that. And just be careful that your shoulders aren't too stiff. A little tapering flow into that neck, and I'd even say you could lower your shoulder a little bit more, so it's again not too straight, not too stiff. And if your shoulders are a certain width, you can do your alignment. Remember we looked at alignment where you can extend your arm, run a straight edge, whether it's a pencil, whether it's whatever it might be, and you can say, well, what if I were to use a vertical line flowing down from the edge of my shoulder, from an eye, from the edge of the nose, whatever you want to use as a gauge, and you can say, well, what is to the left and to the right of that line? So, for example, if I were to just draw a line from that eye, then you can really have a look at and compare how much of the shoulder is past the eye, how much of the hip is past that line, and so on. It's a great and really, really quick and effective way to get some measuring in your poses and making sure that things are a little bit more aligned and more in proportion. So I would say your hips probably need to come out a little bit further because of that before using that method. But just judging it by eye, you can see that. All right, cool, nice one. Okay, a couple of strong drawings here. They've got a nice sense of volume and weight and mass. There's a lovely sense of the curvature of the figure. There's just a sense of solidity, and I think that is largely in part to being, well, having longer poses. 20-odd minute poses where you can actually get some tonal work in. And the tonal work really does add depth. There's no doubt about it. Line work can be very beautiful. It can capture a lot of what the model is doing, of course, and it can capture a lot of information, but tone is where you really get that wonderful sense of depth. So yeah, nice one. Just be careful not to make the neck too long. And again, I'd say more gentle, subtle slope there. I would say maybe the eye line's too high. Bring that down a notch and just put a little bit more onto the top of that head. And you might want to extend the width of your shoulders there in relation. But you've got a lovely shape on the arms, and because of the width of the shoulder being extended, we might need to take those hips over a tad. And just, yeah, I think you've got that angle generally correct, actually. I think maybe your knee comes down a little bit further, a little bit down here, and there's a little bit of an angle on that, so that probably comes across just a little bit more like that. But yeah, we're talking minimal stuff here. Yeah, again with the hair, try not to go in for individual details with the hair. Instead, what is the shape? Mask the shape. We've looked at shape a few times. Get that overall obvious masked shape and block the whole thing in. Block it in. Don't go in for individual strands of hair. And then after you've done that, maybe some directional flow of where some certain details of the hair are, some of the curves at the ends of the hair, it looks like it's got more detail there than you've actually put in. It's more of a suggestion. And then you can actually, if you want, put your rubber and maybe pull out a couple of little bits of highlight here and there that suggests the flow and the shape, the direction of the hair. But you don't need to overdo it. Lovely sketch, by the way. It's a lovely drawing. I'd say again, just watch your foreshortening. I generally think you've got a good shape to it, to the figure. It looks like it's in proportion, generally speaking. But I think because of the foreshortening and the angle, you need to make that area a little bit wider. Yeah, nice suggestion of your patella, by the way. Some nice tonal work in there, which again, like I said before, adds a bit more depth. The angle on this leg's really nicely done. It was tricky. There was no doubt about it. That was one of the most awkward angles. A great test, but it was tricky. Just be careful with the flow down into your wrist. Just curve that a little bit more of a gentle flow into it. I think you've done a good job on that. Maybe your thumb is just a little bit on the small side. Just extend that just a little bit, and a little bit more curve, and bump down into the wrist, and then leading into the palm. But yeah, really lovely work. Yeah, just I think a couple of things I mentioned before. Lovely drawing, by the way. It's a really beautiful sketch. It's got an elegance to it. Yeah, massing the hair and avoiding individual strips. Simplify that. Always simplifying that. And I think one of the best ways of simplifying that is to get the overall shape and block it in. And if then you want to add a couple of little strands at the base of that shape, a couple of little curves to suggest the detail, that's fine, which you've kind of suggested here. But individual areas of the hair, it just makes it look fake. It just makes it look too stiff. I quite like this suggestion of the features. There's a delicate quality to them, I think is generally quite strong, and I quite like how you've suggested that nose there. A little bit more of a bulk on that hair there, and again a little bit more of a flow down in there. You can use the shape of the hair to shape out the shape of the actual face itself. Your sternal, your clavicles are going to be a little bit lower, just down there, and then your clavicles can connect up in there. This is beautiful. I would say though, a little bit more of a bump there, a little bit more of a bump there, but generally speaking, I think you've done a beautiful job on that. There's a lovely, the contours of your arm are beautifully observed there. Your hand's a little bit too small. It's going to come out a little bit wider, although I know a little bit longer. I know that a lot of the cushion was obscuring it, but maybe we could make that wrist area a little bit thicker and just a little bit more of a curve on the arm where it meets the elbow area. This is beautiful, really nicely done. Lovely observed overlap on the breast to the arm. Generally speaking, I think you've got good strong shape to that. The angle there is pretty good. I think maybe a little bit more of a round flow in there. Good strong suggestion of the shoulder, which is dropping down to the other arm. Yeah, that's fine. I think your angle on your knee is good. I think the width of it is good as well. Just maybe a little bit more of a flow in down to the side of the knee before we get to that leg, and a little bit of suggestion of the shape of that knee area where you got the patella. And you can curve your tonal work to match the curve of the limb or leg itself. Cool, lovely draw, really nicely done. Okay, again, a good strong indication of what the model's doing. That's a good start to that. It's just a couple of little things. It's just looking out for your angles, and generally just getting the stiffness out of the drawing. I would say don't worry about features. Focus more on the actual structure of the figure more so. And just be careful of the angle of your shoulders. If your neck is coming down here, then the opposite side is going to be a little bit more of a flow. Your neck is too wide there and your shoulder is too wide there. A little bit more of a gentle flow down into that shoulder. And I would say this shoulder is a little bit too low in relation to that. And remember, you've got your little bump there. Now you've got a lovely flow down that arm, really nicely captured. It's just getting that consistency. A little bump there, which is suggested. It's a little bit skinny at the elbow though. I think that should be a little bit wider. And here, just getting that flowing line down into the wrist. It's a little bit jagged, and your hand is just a teeny bit too small. Just a little bit too small on your hand there. And again, instead of going in for individual details on your fingers, just try massing it. Try locking it in terms of, imagine my hand was in a mitten and what that shape would be. And once you've got that general shape, then maybe afterwards, if you've got that time, you can go in and give it a little bit more nuance. And yeah, with the breast, just I think that heart shape makes sense because it gives it a little bit more curvature and flow and not so stiff, basically. And your knee, sorry, your width of your hip's going to be a little bit wider now because of the, I reckon that shoulder could probably come in a little bit actually. If we make that head just a little bit more height on my head. Yeah, I bring my hips out a little bit more, my upper leg a little bit wider, and just be careful this area here. If we just use a ball joint, we can use that as our guide. Bring that in just a tad, and that means our lower leg is going to be wider, a little bit more of a flow into that. Again, just generally taking the stiffness out of it. I think you've done a lovely job on the angle on this other leg. Definitely overlap that opposite arm, which was tricky, and just get that curve in there to suggest what that cylindrical quality to that shape. And just a little bit of a bump where the lower arm meets the wrist. Just a little bit more of a bump there to suggest that shape and curve down in there. All right, nice one. Okay. Yeah, so this is one of the examples of the acrylic work. Not the horror show that you made that out to be in class, I have to say. I'm pleasantly surprised. Yeah, there's a couple of issues in terms of proportion. Your shoulders, your arms are quite large in relation to the rest of the figure. Okay, that's fine. That's easy. You can just block in a darker tone down here to extend the shape and width of the upper leg or hips, and it'll get a lot more continuity in relation to the size of the arms. And maybe the head is a little bit too small, and just be careful that the angle of your neck and shoulders not too triangular. It's more of a flow as opposed to that angle. A flow as opposed to that angle. That's what I mean. But with your acrylic work, now if you're completely against the acrylic, you just don't like it, you don't enjoy it, that's absolutely fine. Whenever we go to do an acrylic piece, maybe you can use charcoal. That I really don't mind. It's just experimenting. It's just trying out a different medium and seeing how you feel about it. For the next series of acrylic poses, I'll make sure that they're more consistently longer, so you've got more time, and I can show you my general process again. But what I do is I get a thinner brush, and I think that might have been the issue for a lot of people. It's using the wrong brush. Let me just grab a couple here, just to make sure. Yeah, so this kind of brush, this is known as a round. Avoid those. They don't hold enough paint. They usually get ragged, inconsistent lines, which is frustrating. You might think that they're the ideal brush because they've got a thinner tapered edge, but it's actually not the case. Like I said, they don't hold enough paint. The brushes I tend to go in for tend to be either filberts or flats. These are old brushes. They're a little bit ragged, but they are the kind of brushes that I go in for. And you can get a surprisingly thin edge, and they hold a lot more paint, and you can get a good, strong sense of the general shape of your figure. And remember, with acrylic work, it's an impression. It's not going in for exactness like we go in for our pencil or our charcoal poses that are a lot longer. You know, there's a flow and fluidity. There's a looseness about it. You can block in your general outline and your shape, and then it's a case of using various size brushes, some that hold that are a little bit bigger, that hold a little bit more paint, and blocking in the main shadows, the main darks first, because it starts to give the sense of body and a sense of shape, maybe the blocking in the hair, and then using either the same brush or another brush for your middle tones. So your half tones, a little bit lighter, not such obvious darks, and then blocking in your lighter tones. And, you know, following the flow and the direction of the figure, as opposed to dabbing on, like blocking in a nice sense of how light reveals form, how light shapes up your figure. And that's the same with the shadows. Shadows describe form. They're not just arbitrary blocks or dabs. You know, they follow the topography of the figure. And a good way of thinking of your acrylic painting is how you approached your charcoal subtractive drawings. We use a putty rubber to pull out the light to reveal form. With acrylic, it's very, very similar thing. It's just that usually we block in, we're pulling out the shape of shadows, then middle tone, and then light. Although you can do it in reverse. But because I do a lot of oil painting, I quite like to work from dark to light. But generally, that's the same principle and a similar tactic to your charcoal. But yeah, it's a opportunity to experiment, try something out, and see how you feel about it. If you don't like it, that's absolutely fine. You don't have to do it. You can do charcoal, but we will explore that in a little bit more detail, or a little bit more extended version next week when we go through it. Okay, cool. Okay, just make sure I got that in the full screen. Okay. Yeah, very nice angle on your head in relation to your shoulders. That's really nicely done. I love the opposing angle on that. It suggests movement. Even though it's a passive pose, there's still a sense of life to it. And that's nicely done. Just be careful. Maybe the angle of your shoulder just comes up a little bit more extended. That's a beautiful flow down into your collarbone, by the way. It's really nice done. That's a much better indication of the angle of the trapezius in relation to the neck. So nicely done on that. With your head, I'd say it's just a little bit squished. Just extend that. And it could even be a case that you just extend the hairline. And just needs to be brought up just a little bit more. It seems to flatten out too soon. And as I've said before, if you don't have time for features, although in the longer poses there's definitely more of a chance of that you get time to do it, you can just put in your crosshair, or certainly the angle of your eyes, a little bit of a notch for your nose, and just maybe a little suggestion or placement of where the mouth goes. And if you have time, you can go in and extend that and add a little bit more nuance to it. Your arm and your hands are beautiful. They're really nicely done. Maybe this hand's a little bit small, just a tad. Very, very, it's not out by much. I've just extended just a little bit more, certainly in relation to this one. And just with the thumb, I try and avoid the sausage shape. With the thumb, it's notch, and a curve. So just making sure to curve it, to taper it, as opposed to it being a sausage shape like that. Because on the underside, you've got your fleshy pads, which are convex shapes. On the upper side, you've got sharper, more curved, almost C shapes actually. Maybe your sharper, flatter edges there, because there's not fat. It's more it's just muscle really. It's bone and muscle, so it's a little bit of a flatter edge, but it's also got your phalange and phalange. So those two bones create a little bump, and then it heads into the fatty muscle of the metacarpal, and the metacarpal bone is what you get there. So that's I didn't go into detail with that in fairness, but that's what's happening. So you can just avoid that. You can get that more nuanced shape as opposed to I've been too simplified with that. And I would say, again, go in for that mitten shape initially, and then if you have time, you can add a little bit more nuance to that. But generally speaking, I think the beautiful, delicate line for your arms and for your hands, it's a nice touch. I would say use the center line, the line of action, to get more of a to use as a guide. So I would say the center of your breasts are a little bit off. Move that over a little bit more, and this one is over a little bit more, and then you've got and that center line gives you that lovely guide to help you with that. I think generally you've got a good sense of width on the hips. I might extend that a little bit more, especially in relation to our shoulder, and maybe a little bit more of a curved flowing line in there. It's a little bit stiff, and more gentle slope on your hip. Lovely foreshortening on the knee there. That's nicely done. I'd extend that just a tad, but generally speaking, the foreshortening on that is really nice, but you can see that you needed to widen that out just a small bit. Cool, nice one. Okay, so just a couple of things. I'd probably extend that hairline just a little bit, just soften the jaw out a little bit more of a curve, at least initially, and a little bit more of a sloping curve on the trapezius down into the shoulder, and you will have that little bump which I mentioned earlier, where it meets the shoulder and then the upper arm, the deltoid. You can curve that down a little bit more there and widen that just a tad, and that just curves in a little bit more of a suggestion of the muscle here, your bicep, and nice curve down into that wrist. A little bit more of a bump at the elbow, and curve, and that curved in behind the knee, as I remember. Nice shape on the breasts. They feel like they're more naturalistic, and that they're sitting in the chest area. That's nicely done. Just a little bit stiff on this side. Again, just that little flow down into where you got your joints. It just seems, a little bit stiff, and again, just watch the shape of your thumb. It's a little bit small, and I would say because we've taken that out a little bit, and with the size of the head, we need to extend our hips and make our legs a little bit wider, and that will be keeping, and your knees just a little bit lower there, and that's keeping more in relation to the size of the head and the angle of the shoulders. Let's just extend that. It's I think comparing as well, comparative measuring, or using cranial units to help you. How many cranial units wide is the shoulder if you're using the clavicle center line, or the line of action, as a guide. So if that's your center, how many cranial units is it wide to the shoulder, and how many cranial units wide then is the hips, and so on. So nothing exists in isolation. So you're always comparing or using your angle checker to get the angle of your hips in relation to the angle of your shoulders, or your alignment, which tells us a lot. If we were to use the ear as our guide, how much of the shoulders and the hips is to the left of that line, which again, you can't go wrong with your alignment. It's really, really useful. Anyway, got sidetracked there slightly. Got a nice angle on that leg there. Your knee seems in proportion now that I've extended that, whereas before I thought this leg was way too small, but that looks fine now in relation. Maybe just a little bit of a bump there, and then we can extend it out and flow on down. Cool, good stuff. Okay, nice one. Love how you've done the hair. That's really nicely done. It's got a nice looseness to it. I think your proportions are pretty good. There's a good sense of continuity in the shape. It's just a couple of little things. I think maybe the head is a little bit too big. I just bring that in slightly to make it a little bit smaller in relation. It's not by much. It's quite minimal. Your arm is just a little bit skinny there. Get a little bump. Extend the arm and make that a little bit wider. Give it a little bit more width. And you got sitting on the top of the knee, thigh, and just tapering, flowing down into that thumb, and I would say your hand a little bit too small. So we want to make that hand a little bit wider, a little bit longer, and that's more in keeping. Remember, the size of the hand fits into the face, so that's something to keep in mind. Got a little bit of a part of the hip there, and then we're flowing down into our knee and our leg. And generally the width of that's not too bad. I think your lower leg could do have been a little bit wider there, especially at the joint of the knee. Lovely suggestion of the patella. Some nice subtle tonal work in there to suggest that. Really nicely done. Flowing down in there as a suggestion of that bone there, which is really nicely done. Of course, your tibia. Just a little suggestion of the bump on the side of that muscle, a little indent. Good strong angle on this leg, which was like I said, really tricky, but I think you've done a really nice job on that. It did overlap the arm there. I think it extended a little bit further, maybe a little bit like there. And just remember to watch that flow down into your arm. It's a little bit stiff, and this hand is a little bit too small as well, and we need to extend that to a little bit further. I think it was more around that area there. So not by much, but just enough for it to be a little bit short, a little bit small. Okay, cool, nice one. Right, last but not least, this is lovely. It's a really stylized drawing. It has a kind of has a fashion element to it, like those really loose fashion drawings that you get. They're heavily stylized. One of the reasons I say that is you've got these lovely suggestions of tension and weight, and it actually gives the figure a little bit more sense of heaviness, a little bit more sense of mass, which I really, really like how you've done that. Generally, your proportions are pretty good. Again, try and avoid your shape, your massing of the hair being too stiff, too rigid. Now, yes, it does have certain shape to it that you can then block in, as I suggested before, but then you can add a little bit more nuance, but not so rigid, not so uniform. The only other thing I'd say is just to maybe darken your lines a little bit more, just so we can get a good indication of them. And with stuff like that, just try and flow it down in one movement if you can. But yeah, generally speaking, I love the stylistic quality of this drawing. I really like how you've done it. It's very suggestive rather than going into loads of detail. Even though I've just said it's very stylistic, which it is, I'd say maybe just round out that knee a little bit more anyway, and a little bit more flow down into that lower leg, and just gives it a little bit more of a suggestion of the general shape of the knee. And same here, we can perhaps flow down into that hip area a little bit more. Actually, I'd maybe curve it, and our knee is probably a little bit further, somewhere around here in relation, because I remember it was at an angle to that other leg. Something along those lines. But yeah, very nicely done, and I love how you're suggesting weight and pressure in certain areas. It does lend itself to giving it a generally more mass and volume. Nicely done, really. Again, I really like how fluid some of your marks are, and how you're handling the figure in a very stylistic way. Cool, good work, nicely done, folks. Cool, nice one. That's the job. Cool, I hope you found that helpful. If you've got any questions, as always, please do get in touch. I'm happy to have a look at anything that you might want me to look at extra, whatever it is. But cool, that is that. Next week, next lesson, we'll be doing longer poses as well. So you'll be glad to hear we'll be doing more longer poses, especially when it comes to the acrylic. And if you don't want to do the acrylic, that's absolutely fine. You can use charcoal or whatever medium you want, to be fair. But yeah, we'll be looking at an extension of poses, so you got more time to measure, to take in the full figure, but also to add tone and details, to add extra depth and nuance. That's enough for me. I will see you next week. Have a good one, folks. Take care. Stay safe. All the best.